Hi, I'm Kristen. So today I've got quilt backs on the brain. I've been doing this Scrappy quilt back for about 2 weeks and the quilt top only took a couple of days. Anyway, so I'm gonna go through, I think it's 9 ways you can back your quilt. So if you're just starting out with quilts, you're not sure about backing yet, or if you've been backing your quilts the same way for years and you're looking for something different, hopefully you'll find something in this list. So the first few that I'm going to go through I'm just going to run through them because they're going to be the most common ways you've probably seen people backing quilts. So the first one is to buy extra wide quilt backing fabric. So that's something you can get from most quilt shops that comes usually in either 90 inches wide or 108 inches wide. So your standard fabric that you buy by the yard is 44 inches wide. So this is much bigger, so you don't have to piece it in order to make the quilt back. And you can buy like from really big fabric designers like Tula Pink and Timothy Holt and Calf Fassett and things like this. There's plenty of fun designs, but it's expensive. So here, anyway, I had a quick look because I've never used this method, just kind of because of the cost and the way I tend to buy fabric. But a 1/4 meter, so just imagine that's a 1/4 yard, it's a little more, but a 1/4 meter was like £6.70. So let's call that $9 maybe, or $8.50, something like that. So if you had quite a big quilt, like you would have to buy that like 8 times, 6 times, depends how big your quilt is, right? So it could get expensive. But anyway, for a special quilt or one that you just need to have an easy backing on to help you to finish it, that's definitely an option. Number 2 is to piece like regular yardage, 2 pieces of it to make it wide enough. So it could be 3 depending on how big your quilt is. So you're basically using all the same fabric on the back. I've done this quite a number of times. Obviously, you have to, if you're using a directional fabric, this could be an issue which way you decide to put your seams. So if your quilt was, say, 80 inches wide or something like that, two lengths of fabric, you could just do 2 rows. But if it's a directional fabric, you might need to turn it and do more than that and cut it in a different way. So there's some thinking involved in that, but it's still relatively simple. Okay, so the third way, which is quite similar to the second way that you can back your quilt, is to use kind of 2 tones of the same color. So if you don't have enough yardage of one fabric that you can piece together to make the backing, but there's some blue in the front of your quilt, you could piece together some similar blues like in long strips. So I'm going to talk later about how to do scrappier back with lots of different fabrics. But so I did this for my queen size Quilt As You Go quilt. So it was done in 4 long strips, and I had several different navy blue, 2 actually. So I did 1/2, so 2 strips of it in the one blue and 2 strips in the other. So it just looks more kind of intentional, I guess, even though I just didn't have enough of the of the same color. Okay. The next one, 4. So this is one I've talked about on the channel before, and it is one of my favorites. But I know some people are like, eh. So I buy secondhand duvet covers. I think you have those in the States, but basically it's like, instead of a comforter, it's like a slightly thicker than a sheet, but there's 2 layers to it, and you shove a duvet in the middle, and then you take it off and you wash the duvet cover, right? So people replace those and whatever. So I buy those secondhand, and they often have one print on the front and another one on the back. So they're kind of good value for money in that way. And so I cut them apart and tend to use those on backing. So I've done that quite a few times, and I really like it. It probably does depend on the quality of the duvet cover and the material. So I try and buy cotton, and like obviously not something that's gotten bobbly and stuff like that. But so that is another way, like a cost-effective way to get a large piece, one piece of fabric that'll be the size you need and can be in some interesting prints. The next one, number 5, is another one that I've got another video about, which is fleece. So I do like putting fleece on the back of quilts just because it makes them really cuddly and soft. When I buy fleece specifically for quilt backing, it's the kind that's called anti-pill fleece, so that it doesn't like shed and stuff, and it's really easy to work with and really easy to quilt through. And I've got a whole other video on that I'll link to above and in the description and all of that if you're interested in that. And just so you know, you can use a fleece blanket as well. It doesn't have to be yardage of fleece. So I have used old blankets, fleece blankets, in place of bought fleece fabric for backing as well in the past, and it worked out just fine. You can also piece fleece. So if you've got a couple of larger bits of fleece in order to make up a backing, you can absolutely piece those together. I press my seams open when I'm doing that, and I've never noticed a problem with bulk. 6 is to just use another quilt top. So if you're the kind of person who's got lots of whips, you finish a lot of quilt tops and you don't finish a lot of quilts, then just find 2 quilt tops that are complementary, and there's your sandwich with the batting in the middle, obviously. I haven't actually done this before because I don't do a lot of that. So I now have one quilt top, which I've shown on the channel, that I just wasn't loving, but I did spend a fair amount of time on. So I folded it up and saved it, and it's destined to be a quilt backing one day, but I haven't used it yet. So 7 is one of my favorites. So it's kind of like the midway point between just piecing your backing from 2 pieces of the same fabric and going totally scrappy. So this is where you start with larger pieces of fabric, but they're not all the same. So you might go with the colors in the front of the quilt and start that, use that as a kicking off point. So I've done ones where I've started with a fat quarter and then used sort of strips around it, gone around in like a vaguely log cabin kind of a way, and then use larger bits almost as a background. So it is kind of like a secondary quilt on the back. My sister has given me a compliment on one of those backs before because she likes everything extremely modern. And then I've also done ones that are even less complicated than that. So I've had one long piece of yardage, but that would only be big enough for half of the back. And so then I would piece it with a remnant or a fat quarter or a fat eighth or something like that, and kind of come up with a jigsaw that works for the back. And that can be quite pretty, and it's a good Stashbuster, and you just use what you already have. So I really like that way of making a quilt backing, and it's relatively fast. It's not super involved, and it's not going to take as long as it took you to make the quilt top. One thing to keep in mind for this method, and that's why I'm showing you this quilt back again, and actually for the other methods after this in the video, is that you want to be careful where you're placing your dark and light fabrics. So for this one, this was my sailboat quilt. There was dark water on the bottom half and a light sky at the top. And if you're not careful where you put the dark and the light on your backing, it can shine through depending on the thickness of your batting. So if you are doing scrappy back, do just pay attention to the colors on the front. If everything's dark, it doesn't matter too much, but when you start having light backgrounds and things, you might see the backing fabric shining through. So just be aware of that. So I now have some more scrappy options for you. So the first one is if you do have some yardage that you want to use for a backing, but it's not quite enough. It's like this close, but it's not quite there yet. So when I've had this problem before, what I've done is made some scrappy strips from the leftovers from the front, similar to the technique that I used in my video last week about the braided, kind of improv braided scrap blocks. And I talked about this quilt backing in that video as well. So basically I had this, it was one particular quilt I made for a friend, and I had this lovely kind of woodland fabric, but I must have bought it as a remnant or something like that, because it wasn't quite big enough for the quilt. So I managed to make, I think it was 4 long strips, and I cut the fabric and pieced the strip in the middle. And this was like a growing thing. So each time I did it, it wasn't quite big enough. And so I just kept piecing the scraps until I had made something that was big enough to just be the backing. And so you just line up where the, where the intersections are when you're piecing that together. So that was a lot of fun, and I think it did come out looking nice on the back. And it's just a little way that you can kind of stretch. You could also do it more simply. You don't have to do it with all the tiny little scraps. You could make a strip of anything that's going to go in the middle to make your fabric stretch so that it's big enough. So it could be orphan blocks, it could be some other kind of scrappy strip, or just a bunch of jelly roll strips in order to make it wide enough to fit what you're looking for. The next option, of course, is just to make a block-based backing. So if you've ever seen Karen Brown's channel, she's got a great video about what she calls after quilts. So that's, again, using the scraps from the front to make blocks for the back. And you just make, you make basically a secondary quilt top that goes on the back, but ideally not taking as much time with it. So I've done that before. My the first quilt actually finished, not the first one I was working on, but the first one I actually finished, the baby quilt, had sort of blocks, and I'm pretty sure I would have gotten that after quilt idea from Karen Brown at the time. So that's a good option, and you can use orphan blocks, leftover blocks, or just be making other kind of blocks as you're sewing. So if you've got scraps already left over from the cutting and you're chain piecing for the quilt top, you could try chain piecing with the backing in mind and make some secondary blocks for the back as you go along. The last one, which is the one that I've been working on right now. I've done it a few times, but it's the one that I'm working on right now that's gotten me kind of in the brain space of quilt backing, is just like totally improv with the scraps. So the one I'm working on now has taken me about 2 weeks or more. I'm done now. The quilt is basted and I've started quilting it, and hopefully I can show it to you in the next week or two. But I started off with my quilted braid improv technique, but you can also use crumb quilting. I've done completely random ones, like for the back of my first denim quilt, which was just all the leftovers from the front, done in all sorts of random ways. And you can just kind of get creative with it. I don't always love exactly how they look sometimes. Sometimes they look great, but I really like the process of sewing them. So if you're looking for something like meditative and you just don't want to think, and you're using your sewing and your quilting as a de-stressor, doing a backing or even a quilt top like this can be super fun. But it's also a great way to use up funny shaped scraps that you get from cutting somebody's pattern and they didn't think about the scraps that were left over and things like that. So I hope you enjoyed that quick run through of quilt backing options, and that you found an idea for your next quilt. I'd also love to hear if you've got any other ways that you back your quilts that I haven't mentioned, because I'm always looking for other things to try. So do let me know. If you like this video, please do subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and leave me a comment and introduce yourself and let me know what you thought of the video. Thanks so much for spending time with me, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.